When we announced we were selling our sailboat, Esper, to move on to new adventures, a number of you had one particular suggestion. Quite frankly, you could live on a 40-foot narrowboat on the Kennet and Avon Canal and your content would still be brilliant. And so it was decided. We went out and bought a narrowboat. Only joking. But I did take a week's holiday while back in the UK, venturing onto the Cambridgeshire waterways with my father and one of my brothers, Tim, where we successfully ran aground so badly we had to spend the night stuck up a dead end. Well, if you ever thought canal boating was a gentle wander in the countryside compared to sailing, think again, because we've just had a bloody nightmare. We are stuck here. The boat ran aground. More on that embarrassment later. But if you're thinking this trip is a precursor to Liz and me buying a narrowboat, it's not. This trip was just a coincidence. My family take regular holidays on the water and have far more experience on the canals than I do, where I'm more at home sailing around a smoking volcano or through shallow coral reefs in the tropics. They're more comfortable navigating the muddy canals replete with discarded shopping trolleys or inner city urchins dropping onto their boat from a footbridge. The last time I was on a canal boat was in 1986 with the Scouts. Yep, the Furlongs were a scouting family. That's me and my Essex boy white socks and black slip-on shoes with tassels with the rest of my family. My only memory of that canal trip was the burnt-out mills of Birmingham and the scout leader having me up against the wall by the scruff of my neck, accusing me of spiking the spaghetti bolognese with laxative while his girlfriend freaked out because she had a heart condition, apparently. I didn't do it, by the way. Spike the dinner with laxative, I mean. That would have been Philip Gaywood, but he never admitted to it, so I took the flak. Anyway, at least on this trip I was in good hands with my family, and no spag bowl was eaten. You'd think canal boating is about as far removed from sailing as you could get, but there are many similarities. 12-volt electrics and diesel engines are two of them, but the main one is gaining access to unadulterated nature. Proof that whether you're anchored by a remote island in Indonesia or moored up on one of England's gentle rivers, Mother Nature always catches your breath. This trip was based around the waterways of Ely in Cambridgeshire in what is known as the Fens. In fact, technically speaking, we weren't on the canals at all, but on the River Great Ouse, one of 17 rivers in the UK called the Ouse, possibly an old Celtic word meaning water. This is one of the oldest commercial waterways, although the locks and sluices these days predominantly service the leisure industry. Honestly, the timing couldn't have been better, with the riverbanks punctuated by the turning autumnal leaves and few tourists around. Many times on this trip we had the river to ourselves. If this was to become our new lifestyle, we could do a lot worse than the beautiful vistas of the fenlands. From the 17th century onwards, this entire network of both canal and river were developed for trade, like the transportation of sugar beet. The stretch between Denver and Ely, where Dad, Tim and I spent the week, became the river's commercial backbone in the 19th century. Ely was an essential inland port for trade, and even though much of this has disappeared, it's still a busy network for leisure boats. Dad and I picked up our 52-foot narrowboat, Osprey, from Bridge Boatyard. I'll give you a quick guided tour later, but first we had to turn the boat around. And so our week on the narrowboat begins, and we're starting off with the expert on the helm, who's going to do a 180 down the river, which is what river is this? The Ouse. This is the Ouse. There's a lot for me to learn on this trip. I don't even know the names of the rivers. How about that? Yeah, a bit embarrassing. I've spent the last 20 years expertly navigating dangerous open oceans, yet I don't even know the river 30 miles from my hometown. Must do better. I'll be honest though, I left it to Tim and Dad to plan this trip. I was just going along for the ride. It was nice not having to do any passage planning for once. After turning the boat around, we made the long and arduous journey of half a mile into Ely itself. We're in the town of Ely, which is where we're starting from. And just behind that willow tree ahead of you, you can see Ely Cathedral. Well, I can anyway. It's very big, it's impressive. You can't talk about Ely without mentioning its impressive cathedral. perched atop the highest hill in the area, a staggering 26 metres above sea level, the ship of the Fens, as it was once known, can be seen from every direction for miles. It is an engineering marvel, as impressive from 5 miles away as it is close up. We're benefiting from some lovely late afternoon sun. I don't know if it's going to be like this all week, but it's rather splendid, isn't it? This dogleg is set up for water-based leisure pursuits, including drinking at one of the waterside inns. The pubs on the north bank and the tiny marinas on the south were divided by rowing boats cutting a line through the still river, passing the ever-present anglers perched on their folding chairs with flask and packed lunch, enjoying some quiet time away from the missus. The banks of the Ely riverside made for a comfortable first stop, where Dad and I waited for Tim to join us next morning. They had devised a passage plan that would take us downstream towards Denver's Sluice. This stretch of river is non-tidal, thanks to the sluice gates that redirect the Ouse in 2 directions. One along its natural tidal path towards King's Lynn and out to the Wash in the North Sea, and the other along a man-made stretch of water called the Relief Channel. We would then turn around, head back up the River Great Ouse, explore the 2 tributaries of the Lark and the Little Ouse towards Brandon Lock. Keep watching for that because it's where we got stuck for the night. After dropping Dad off at Ely, Tim and I would continue upstream along the winding Old West River. That's a lot of motoring for a 1 week, but Tim was keen for me to experience the breathtaking nature of the Cambridgeshire waterways, and breathtaking it was. This first run up the Great Ouse towards Denver Sluice was the least exciting of our trip, but it gave me a chance to get my head around steering a long lump of steel by tiller, and for Tim to demonstrate his extensive knowledge of the waterways, having worked alongside the Environment Agency in his previous job.
River erosion is obviously a very natural thing. It has to occur, such is the way of the meandering of rivers. Because we have converted our riverways into leisure facilities, we are obviously putting more and more motorised craft up and down them, and that creates wash, and the wash will eventually erode the banks of the river. The wider the river, the less that occurs. However, there are a few things that we do to stop this river erosion. There's the natural defences, which are the reeds that they encourage. So obviously the reeds are natural to this environment, but they are encouraged to grow. So they will, to a certain extent, stop some of the erosion going on. Unfortunately, every now and again, we have to put in these metal railings as well, which are great for mooring up against with a boat, but they look a little bit unsightly and unnatural. And then as we get towards the industrial areas, obviously we have a lot more control around the erosion because there's a lot more need for us to prevent flooding, whereas the more rural the environment, the more we take upon the flooding of the fenlands, which ultimately is what the fenlands were created for 300, 400 years ago, to flood and to take all the water from these beautiful rivers.
Further downstream, we were shouted at by angry men with megaphones to get out the way of athletic college students in rowing boats before arriving at the intimidating Denver Sluice complex. Locks are a big feature of canal boating. On some journeys through the English canals, you can end up doing dozens of locks in one day, and it can be exhausting work. It was therefore kind of ironic that the one lock we contended with on this journey was entirely electric, leaving no chance of getting any aerobic exercise in. Not that that's what I was looking for. See, we're surrounded by a whole series of sluices. There's one over there. This is the canal that we're trying to get to. Then you have another sluice over here, and that's the Relief Canal, I think it's called. We're not allowed down that, but that allows them to let the water flood out if they have too much rain. And right now Dad and Tim are taking a look at the control panel. So this lock is electronically controlled, and we as boat hirers have a special key to open up this panel. Okay, in the lock. Tim is now at the other control panel at the other end, and he's now going to open the gates to allow the water out. Meanwhile, keep the engine running, and the advice from both Tim and Dad is don't need to tie off. We've got Tim on the dock there, we've got the lines ready. But normally when you're letting water out of a lock, it impedes less on the boat's movement than if you're letting water into the lock. All good? Is the water going down already?
It's supposed to be. I'm just trying to see if it is. You feel like you're going down?
Not sure about that. So Dad's just holding the bow in. You can see these chains here which allow us to put the bow lines on the chain. Never ever double them up. You should always allow just one wrap around them so that you can release them in an emergency. And meanwhile, Tim's walked up to that front control panel when we're down, and then the gates should open at the other end. And then it's a hard left. We can't turn right because that's the other sluice that feeds into the other relief channel. As charter boat tourists, we weren't allowed to continue up the tidal section of the Ouse, which is why hoi polloi are filtered off through the lock and into the relief channel that runs parallel with it. This channel is wide and straight, but it was at this point in our trip that I realised just how much nature we were surrounded by. Our stop for the night was at the Saxon market town of Downham Market, once famous for its butter and nicknamed the gingerbread town. We put in an additional stop for the guys at Bridge Boatyard to come and swap our troublesome domestic batteries, so this gave us a chance to top up with fresh drinking water. There are thousands of drinking water points on the English canals, maintained by the Canal and River Trust. They are supplied for free, although all boats pay a licence to the CRT to help cover their costs. Bear in mind, the CRT, responsible for the maintenance of over 2,000 miles of waterways across England and Wales, is a charity. Its role in the maintenance of the canal network is to be commended, especially as grants and funding have been severely cut over the years. Because we only had the boat for the week, we turned around at this point, but I think if I were living on a boat, I could quite happily spend a week hanging out on the relief canal, if for no other reasons than the bird life and tranquility. It wasn't until we turned off the Great Ouse onto one of its tributaries that the real adventure began. The Little Ouse is a stretch of river that wheedles its way towards the town of Brandon. At the start, we passed liverboards in both narrowboats and widebeams, tied up to permanent moorings, many with their own gardens, vegetable patches and picnic tables. One even had its own resident peacock. I was starting to realise just how extensive the Canal liveaboard community is. One of the fascinating things about this trip, especially going down this particular tributary, is realising how there are entire communities hidden away from everyone. You would not know that these people live here on their boats full time, tucked away in the countryside, whose access is really only available by the little river. I suspect there's probably a few country roads attached to the odd house that we see here and there, but they are well and truly separated from the rest of society, I suppose. It's kind of like my dream, really. I love the idea of that, being tucked away with this stunning scenery. As I'm looking sort of south, I suppose, across the fenlands and various woods and copses and trees, fields, sheep. It's very rural, extremely quiet, apart from the odd jet that flies over. It's just so tranquil. It really is a very, very peaceful way of life. Being a tributary of the Great Ouse, the Little Ouse is narrow in width and wild in nature. Having passed the last of the liverboards, we were now well into the heart of the Fens, the little river running a divide between the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk. In the late afternoon sun, it was breathtaking. Our destination for the night was slap bang in the middle of RSPB Lakenheath, a Royal Society for the Protection of Birds sanctuary. Mooring up here required jumping ashore onto a boggy bank and driving stakes into the ground to secure the lines. At last, it was just us, the Little Ouse and the birds. We've just spent the night at RSPB Lakenheath, and for those of you who are not familiar, RSPB is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and they have dedicated areas restricted specifically for bird watching, and this is one such example. So we're surrounded by the flatlands of the Fens. Lakenheath, meanwhile, is an American air base. So first thing this morning when I went for a beautiful little walk just as the sun was rising, surrounded by literally hundreds and hundreds of geese flying overhead in their flocks, honking away, making quite a racket. And then after they had sort of settled a mile down the river there, the jets started. So now we have the jets flying over from the airbase. So a bit of a mixture of noise here, but it's rather tranquil here. This river is the Little Ouse. It's a tributary off the Great Ouse. And in fact, it divides the two counties of Norfolk and Suffolk. So as we are moored right here on this bank, we are in Norfolk. Were we to have tied up on that side, literally just 20 metres over that side, we'd be in Suffolk. We continue to head towards Brandon, where the Little Ouse got both more ridiculously beautiful and more ridiculously narrow. Well, this time of year, which is sort of the autumn break, coming up to half-term holiday, now the kids are off school, and there are very few people here. We've seen a couple of charter boats, but it seems as if most of the boats pootling up and down here, probably just local people going out for the weekend. But what there is in great numbers, of course, is bird life. I've never seen so many cormorants in one place. We saw a harrier hovering above the pub that we'd stopped off at. We saw a kestrel as well. And I also have never seen so many swans, believe it or not. There are swans everywhere. And today, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we've got all the geese flying over as well. So if for no other reason it's worth coming down here for a bit of bird watching, it's just a shame that I don't have a decent lens on the camera. Maybe in time I'll treat myself to something like that, because there are some great photo opportunities here. Kingfishers as well, we saw quite a few kingfishers. It is a real twitcher's dream, this area. You know what's nice about canal boating versus sailing, and that is when we're underway we don't have to do any stowing. Coffee pot left out. Look, there's a mug on the countertop there. It's all perfectly safe because nothing gets thrown over because it's so flat here. Nice big windows in the saloon, and looking forward, of course. So even if you're inside, get a nice view of the passing countryside. Osprey is actually 52 foot, which is not particularly big as narrowboats go. I mean, you can get a lot smaller. You can also get a lot bigger as well. If I were to buy a narrowboat, I think I'd be looking at well over 60 foot. You could quite comfortably live on a boat this size, and indeed we see people living on much smaller boats as well. But I do like to have my own space on a boat, and that's perhaps something that maybe this boat doesn't have. Although, having said that, it does have two full-size cabins, so two double beds, and then obviously in the saloon this bed is made up by the bunk here, which during the daytime is your seating area, and that table drops down and makes a third double bunk. So it could sleep three couples quite easily. I'd say the galley is quite small. I don't think that's much bigger than Esper's work area, to be honest. In fact, I'd even say Esper's probably got a bit more space. Just as I was getting comfortable inside the boat, watching swans passing by from the galley window, disaster struck. Well, if you ever thought canal boating was a gentle wander in the countryside compared to sailing, think again, because we've just had a bloody nightmare. We are stuck here. This is Brandon Lock, as you can see behind me. We are actually safely tied up at the moment, but essentially at this point the water dries out and the lock is no longer operational, so the lock has completely dried out. And so the idea was to get to this point and turn around and go back. However, the problem is that it's all silted up around the entrance to the lock and the sluice. So when we came to approach the sluice to turn around to 180, the boat ran aground. We managed to back up, which we did successfully, and fortunately there were a couple here in a little boat, a guy called Marcus, who very kindly agreed to hang around and to help us out. So our next idea was to back the boat up, reverse her under the underhanging trees down there where the river widens just a tiny bit, and to sort of swing around, back end in, so that we're then 90 degrees to the river. I had the idea that the flow of the river, the tide, will push the bow around. Unfortunately, where we decided to do this was exactly the width of the boat, and the bow ran aground basically on the bank edge. So we tried that for a while actually, and eventually we had to give up. So we took the boat back up, and the third attempt was to lash a line to the stern of the boat and to swing it round the opposite way to what we'd just been trying on our second attempt. And unfortunately the same thing happened. The river's just too narrow to be able to turn the boat around. This was probably took about 3 hours worth, and we're back where we started. Now I'm just walking over the sluice now. As you can hear, it's getting very loud because this is the flow of water we are having to contend with. So that's the water flowing underneath this bridge here, and there we are moored up there. So you can imagine trying to push a canal boat into this stream is very difficult. And in between here and the boat, probably around about there, is where it gets very shallow. It's silted up, and in fact, as we walk over to the lock, which is no longer operational, here we can see this is the sluice gate for the lock. And here we have the lock doors. This is open. So that's the lock, which is all fine and well, isn't it? Except when you look at the water on the other side, it's completely dried up. So where does this leave us? That's a very good question. Well, we've called the guys up, and I say the guys from the charter company. They're pretty chilled actually. Two brothers that run this joint. It's a family-run business. They've been going for years. What I'm hoping is that they have seen everything. So I'm hoping this isn't too much of a headache for them. And I'm just walking down to the slipway, which is in between the sluice and where we're moored up. I just wanted to show you how shallow it is. It's very clear, but you can also see just how shallow that is. It's less than a metre. Now, if you were on a boat that was easy to steer in astern, another consideration would be to just go backwards. However, you saw some of the footage from this tributary that comes down here. It's very narrow, and narrow boats do not really steer in astern. Plus, of course, you've got this current that's pushing the boat in the direction you want to go to. So I think reversing it up would be difficult, bearing in mind, of course, that the next point at which we can turn around is some miles away. So I don't think that's really an option either. I'm going to give the guys a call again. They've had time to sleep on it, and to ask for their advice and see what we should do next, because I am clueless. It is no exaggeration to say that after our failed attempts we were exhausted. So we tied up, pointing the wrong way, and went into Brandon Town for coffee instead. Right, we have some semblance of a plan. It's the next morning, it's quite early, and our hero of the day is Chris. Now, we've already met Chris. He came out on the first day to check the batteries. He's the yard's Mr. Fix-It man, and he knows this place quite well. So we're going to try and stick to the inside channel. Keep as close to the bank as possible. Problem is that there is a bar of gravel just by that slipway, which is where we ran over last time, we hit last time. If we can get it over that, it's then deep the other side towards the sluice, and so that's what we're going to try and do. Is it worth going closer to the slip?
Yeah, we'll try, yeah.
Yeah.
That did get anywhere close to where I thought it was going to get.
Yeah. So what was interesting was when I was chatting to Chris this morning, and he said that he knows this place well, and it is low here. The water is very low. If you look behind him, you can see the bank. He said normally you can't see that bank. Just going to try and get in a little bit closer this time. Well, there's an idea.
I've done before.
Right, so Chris is just suggesting we're making an actual channel. So we're going to the narrowboat's going to become a dredger. So we keep hitting it. We create a little furrow for it to go through. Well, Chris tried a number of times himself, and after the third attempt, tied up once more and got on the phone.
But you can't physically get across to get to it. I've tried reversing up. There is a bit that opens up a bit further back, but I've actually I've struggled to come back to the mooring. It's that low. Can Denver do anything if they shut the gates? Will that back it up?
What's your idea, just for camera, Chris?
Well, I'm hoping to get Denver to do us a favour and shut the gates. So that then it will back the water up and give us a bit more water here, because it does fluctuate up and down a bit, obviously. So hopefully that will. I mean, it might naturally do it with the tides, but I'm not sure what the tide times are. We'll have to speak to the lockkeeper at Denver for that one.
Right.
That might back us up, but hopefully and give us a bit more water. We don't need much.
How long would that take?
I don't know, to be honest. I know Ely to King's Lynn is about an hour and a half's difference. So what that equates to from Denver, I'm not sure.
There was only one thing for it. Time to get the waders on. You can see just how shallow this section of the river was. Chris barely got his thighs wet as he waded his way across that pesky sandbank that was causing us so many problems. So Chris just pointed out these black lines here. There's your tide marks, or rather the water levels, and you can see how it's been dropping and dropping. Can you bring the boat really close in?
That's what I'm thinking now.
Where...
I'm looking for a deep channel.
Yeah, so...
At the moment, I think I've got a leaky wader.
Oh no!
Around my ankle. No, it's this bit here. Look. It's
Yeah.
this bit I can't get across.
It's just about trying to find a little channel to push the boat through, but as we saw as he came in, it's possibly deep roughly there, but it then gets shallow again, and there is a bar that runs all the way across. So this is Tath, and he's general maintenance cleaner around here, but he's a man that knows a thing or two about this whole setup, and he said that there is a possibility we could get the Environment Agency down to actually open up this gate here to allow some water in. And normally they're down here every day, you said? Yeah. Right, well, let's see what happens. Meanwhile, I've got my coffee waiting for me. hand delivered.
Right then, I'll see you later.
Thank you so much, Tath. Yeah, take care, mate. Well, while Tim and I were busy drinking our coffee, Chris and Dad were busy giving it another go. And this time they succeeded in turning the boat.
Can we go back and do it again so we can get video of it?
I'll tell you what though, where we went over just then, that's where we ran aground. So there was definitely more water, and more water since you tried earlier.
Yeah, I think so as well, yeah.
So what's caused that? Is that just a natural rising tide?
I think it has come up slightly. But again, where we had this in there, giving it some fruit, it might have just created, just washed it a couple of inches away, which might have been all we needed.
Yeah.
It's possible.
There we go, bit of perseverance and possibly some rising water, the difference of maybe perhaps an inch, and that's all it took. No.
Inch or two,
Yep.
That's all it needs.
Well, thank you, Chris. You can go home.
Well,
happy
I've got 2 boats coming out today. Hopefully they've done all the checks on them. It's about a 40-minute drive from here, so I came straight from home. Thank you very much. No, you're welcome. Hopefully you get to the main river. Yeah. I think it's come up a little.
Well, there we go. Before you knew it, we were back on our way again, down the Little Ouse once more. As a sailor used to navigating reefs with a 2-metre keel, running aground is a fear that has followed me for 2 decades. It seems, however, that this is par for the course on narrowboats. Drying or silted canals are not uncommon, and with their relatively flat bottoms, it's a lot less hassle when you plough the bow into a load of mud. Shifting the weight from the front of the boat by getting all the crew to the stern helps lift the bow up, and with the engine in hard astern, it's not too difficult to get yourself out of trouble. But if you are going to run aground on the canals, make sure you do it with plenty of breathing space. You won't find any of that on the Little Ouse. Our next destination was the River Lark, another tributary that leads to the amusingly named town of Prickwillow.
It's like one of those Chinese, you know, those little Chinese finger traps they used to buy. It's like that, isn't it? Oh, oh God.
Where are we?
We are, I can't say it without getting embarrassed. We're in Prickwillow. It's like a tree with a willy. This is the River Lark. The River Lark. Which is where the saying larking about actually comes from. Because back in the medieval times, when the Fens were created, of course, people used to down tools and have a little play in the river, and that's where larking about comes from. Had nothing to do with birds whatsoever. It's just a fallacy.
And if you believe that, as Tim's older brother, I've learned to give him space for his whimsical fantasies. Last year, while on a country walk, he tried to convince me that you could tell the age of an oak tree by hugging it. He spent a full 10 minutes demonstrating the technique and concluded that the oak that we had stopped at was 183 years old. He probably wasn't far off it, to be honest. Maybe there's something in it. We headed back into Ely to drop Dad off, where I made an interesting observation that backs up an old stereotype: the snobbery between liveaboards and charter boats. On the whole, we found most boaters courteous and friendly, and, as you saw at Brandon Lock, a willingness to help fellow cruisers by people like Marcus. Now, you see the boat heading in our direction. As he approached our bow, I got a quick nod and I replied with a hi. But at the back end of the boat, both Tim and Dad said good morning and they were ignored. That's difficult to do when you pass someone by only a couple of metres away, but I suspect this guy had clocked that we were a charter boat. Now look, this may sound petty, but as someone who's lived on the water for 20 years, I know this kind of attitude exists. A guy recently told me a story of a Widebeam owner chatting to a narrowboat owner. When the Widebeam owner told the narrowboat owner he had a Widebeam, the narrowboat owner turned his back on him and refused to engage in any further conversation. It reminded me of the disdain some monohull owners have for catamarans, but come on guys, we're all in this together. It shouldn't matter what vessel you're on, we're all enjoying the water. We don't need gatekeepers, so let's share the love, man. After dropping Dad off, Tim and I continued south, upstream, into what is called the Old West River. Actually, this is still the Great Ouse, but it's the narrow section that deviates from the main river, which becomes the River Cam that leads to Cambridge. The first section feels positively populated as we passed an old pump station and then a community of liveaboards. Some of these boats are fully kitted out with wind generators, solar panels and of course log burners. We're still on the Great Ouse officially, although this section is called the Old West River. It's very narrow. We've just been past the Lazy Otter Marina and you can see it gets even narrower here. I think there's a little dog leg to the left. We've got about another hour to go. And the Old West just got narrower and narrower. At one point we turned a hard right on a corner that even we, in a relatively small 52-foot narrowboat, struggled to negotiate. Despite the overcast day, one couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the Old West River, a place where time has seemingly stood still. So we really are now well into the countryside, surrounded by nothing but fens. As you look at this river now, this is actually quite wide compared to some of the bits we've been through, some twists and turns, and they've even put some buoys out on some of the shallow corners to avoid. A little bit overcast, but that doesn't detract from the stunning beauty of the countryside, does it? Rather splendid, but this was what Tim wanted to do. He wanted to take me well away from pretty much everything. It took a while to find the mooring Tim had been looking for, which it turns out had been relocated further down the river due to erosion. When you're surrounded by this kind of countryside, there's only one thing for it. Put on the walking boots and go for a wander. Can you tell us about your bridge?
This is an old drover's bridge where they drive cattle from one field to the next. If you look around you, it's all basically fenland, and what they did was they used pumps that were originally wind, then they started to use steam, then diesel and eventually electricity before they're decommissioned. And what those pumps did was they pumped all the water out of the fens to drain them, to turn them into the farmland.
Can you tell me what happened to our mooring spot, which was supposed to be right behind us?
Right, so yeah, as I said earlier, obviously we have erosion issues on the rivers, and they obviously find their own way naturally, and unfortunately due to lots of mooring that's gone on this particular bend here, they've had to move the mooring further around the corner, and it threw me completely because I was here 6 years ago and I always remember in my mind that it was opposite this lovely woodland over here because I remember the sound of the woodpeckers. So we came around the corner and it was all just overgrown marsh, so just reeds that have been planted there specifically obviously to protect it. Just as I said earlier, natural defence for that meander there. So you can imagine as the water flows, it causes this erosion effect, which is exacerbated by all the boats that have moored there over time. So they're trying to obviously naturally rebuild the defence on the bend there. And as such, they've moved the mooring further around the corner. Thank goodness we found it.
Traditional farming practices continue in the Fens. with tractors ploughing those dark soiled fields to the breeding of alpacas. Wait, what? Of all our stops on this trip, this one was perhaps the most peaceful and silent. It was time to start making our return journey, but the Old West is so narrow we were obliged to continue west to Hermitage Lock, where we turned the boat around to retrace our steps. On our way up, Tim had taken a photograph of a kingfisher, so, using the photo's metadata, he was able to locate its position for another photo opportunity on our return journey. It was a shame neither Tim nor I had any decent lenses with us for bird photography, but that didn't detract from the pleasure of dropping the engine down into tickover and plodding along at a snail's pace, observing riverside wildlife. We put in one more stop, 2 miles from a village called Streatham, where we discovered a rather splendid village pub. Returning to our boat, we found that someone had left the gate open and were greeted by some inquisitive Frisians and goslings.
What? Get lost. Make them go away. I don't like animals.
So there we have it. A splendid week in the fenlands of Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Norfolk, an area I know all too well by road, but had little experience of by water. I guess the question you're all asking yourselves is life on a narrowboat for us? Well, having spent 20 years on a 43-foot sailboat, we're used to living in compromising spaces with limited storage. But while Esper is 4 metres across at her widest, a narrowboat is only 6'10". And even though Osprey is 9 foot longer than Esper, I'm not sure there's any more living space. 52 foot would be a squeeze, so it would be interesting to see how a 70-foot narrowboat or even a Widebeam would compare. I'll leave you with this final thought. For 20 years, people have been asking us how we could live in such a confined space aboard our sailboat, and our answer is always the same. The boat is a means for travel and a place to eat and sleep. Come rain or shine, most of our time is spent outside. The surrounding water are our walls and the sky our ceiling. What we live on is less important than how we live.